It's widely noted that President Clinton was not necessarily an active campaigner for Gore. And part of that is because both Clinton and Gore are, under the shadow of the Lewinsky scandal and the impeachment. And so in some ways, the whole impeachment of Clinton has just as much of an effect on Vice President Al Gore as it did on sort of the whole, Clinton legacy. And so when I talk about the what if aspect, I always go back to the economy when we're talking about presidential elections, because it becomes such a determining factor. History would have probably told us that, since the economy was going so well under the second term of Clinton, that, Gore, not only should have been favored to win, but probably should have won. Obviously, he did, have more of the popular vote. However, obviously, that is not the case. I would argue that if Gore had won the 2000 election, we've talked about the pendulum swinging, right, back and forth between Republicans and Democrats. Had Gore won and there was 4 more years of a Democrat, that would have been 12 years of the Democrats. You could maybe infer or assume that the pendulum would have swung back to the Republicans in 2004. And if that were to have happened, I'm not so sure there is a Obama presidency in 2008 because of the pendulum swinging back and forth. And trust me, if our own state of Indiana voted Democrat in 2008, well, only the 4th time since, since the turn of the 20th century, that should tell you something about where the country was in wanting a Democrat in office in 2008, all right? Now, let's go back to what was said there at the end about questioning the whole efficacy of our election system, specifically with the Electoral College, all right? Because 2000 brought the whole argument of the Electoral College back into focus. Prior to 2000, there had only been 3 times since the inception of the Constitution that a presidential candidate had won the popular vote and lost the election. Well, since 2000, so over the course of 20 years, we've now had it happen twice in 20 years. And that's part of the reason people are arguing against, keeping the Electoral College. That being said, I don't think we're getting rid of the Electoral College anytime soon. See if you can make the connection. Let's go back to our own state of Indiana and understand why. Remember, it's a winner-take-all system in the majority of our states. So I have 2 that don't function that way. So remember what I said about Indiana. Indiana typically votes with what party in presidential elections, Democrat or Republican? Republican. Why? Because you have Indianapolis as the urban center, which is voting Democrat, but those votes are outweighed by all the Republican counties that are circling the urban center of Indianapolis, and so ends up going red Republican because all of those votes end up topping the votes of the urban center. So who would probably be widely against eliminating the Electoral College, especially if you go back to what happened in 2016? Which party would probably be very much against eliminating the Electoral College? Eleanor? Republicans, right? Because if you were to just go off of popular vote, right, or get that to mirror, more closely the popular vote, well, who would have won in 2016? The Democrat Clinton. Who would have won in 2000? The Democrat Gore. It just makes common sense, people, right? Because in these large urban centers, they are voting Democrat, and that's how you swell up a lot of the popular vote. Eleanor. So that's a great question. I'll just repeat what Eleanor said. If every state voted if the vote was based off of the congressional districts, would it favor the Democrats? The answer to that is, it just depends, right? It would definitely much more closely mirror or reveal what the popular vote is. So for example, right, if in Marion County, right, we had, you know, people voting Democrat, and there were, you know, what let's call it, let's just say one electoral vote for Marion County, right? Because we have Andre Carson as our one representative. Instead of all of the votes going Republican, you would have one at least going to the Democrat candidate. And part of the reason why I say it depends, it would depend on the particular state. California, all right, would be really interesting because California, you've got 55 electoral votes that are going to the Democrats because, you know, the votes then outweigh there. But if you were to take it by congressional districts, you would have a much more perhaps even split between Democrats and Republicans, because being in Los Angeles and being in San Francisco is much different than if you were in the middle of the state of California. See why I say that it just depends. But it would much more closely reveal how we as the people are actually voting. So that's part of the reason 2000 becomes, you know, so important. It also reveals how critical the swing states are. Florida, right, was a primary example of showing how these purple or swing states become very key in the presidential elections. And 2000 is basically a window into, you know, what happens in 16, what happens, you know, pretty closely in 20, but, you know, 16 was almost a mirror image of 2000. And obviously the big outlier is the fact that the Supreme Court steps in to make the decision, first and only time that that was done. Now, as far as Bush is concerned, you know, the real beginning of his presidency is probably, you know, the September 11th attacks of 2001. And I know we've been talking about this question, you know, quite a bit. And so I'll just kind of give you my own take as far as Bush is concerned about whether or not it's the, you know, president that defines the time period or the time period that defines the presidency. I think in this case, it's twofold. I would make the argument that the time period and the events of 9/11, without question, define his presidency. But then in turn, it's the way that he responds. And, you know, so in some regard, it is the president, in this case, Bush, you know, defining the time period a little bit. What you may not realize is that, you know, in the aftermath of 9/11, definitely in the short term, the American public responds very favorably to Bush and the Bush administration. And this is why initially, you know, in 2003, when there's talk about going to war in Iraq, not only is there congressional support, but there's wide public support for that. Because you're coming off the heels of, you know, people being, you know, overly concerned about terrorism. And Bush's approval rating, you know, in the months after 9/11 is extremely high. He has a very high approval rating of how him and his administration are responding to the events of 9/11.